We often hear about traumatic events on the news and wonder, how do people cope with that? People do every day. It is possible to move through, move on, and move forward. How? Find out next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. And tonight we're taking your questions on coping after trauma. So call the numbers on your screen right now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. And of course, you can also text us your questions or email them using the number or address listed at the bottom of your screen. We're starting by introducing our guest. Sabrina Matheny is a licensed clinical social worker at the Human Development Center, where she specializes in the treatment of children, adolescents, and adults who've experienced trauma. And Bill Maloney is the Director of Psychological Health for the 148th Air National Guard Fighter Wing here in Duluth, and he's a National Certified Trauma Specialist. Thanks to both of you for coming out tonight. A little bit balmier weather than we had a week ago when we had Miss Mount Everest, Lori Schneider. We had hauled out the cold weather for her. We've got the warmer weather for our more tender guests here.
Thank you.
Excellent. Yes, yeah. Yes. Yeah. And you all should recognize them because these are old hats, and so you recognize them and get calling these questions in. We're going to start by defining trauma. I think Sabrina will talk with you. Just define for us exactly what constitutes a traumatic life event.
I think trauma is one of those words that we hear a lot, and when we think about trauma in terms of mental health, we think about something that involves like a serious injury or death, or the threat of a serious injury or death to either oneself or someone close to the person, or that someone may witness. And so
a lot of people refer to sometimes as being traumatized by a divorce or traumatized by a death of a loved one, or traumatized by bullying. Where does that fit in on the trauma scale, or does it even make the trauma scale?
Well, we consider those events distressing. Like, they might be hard, they might be difficult. People might have, feelings associated with those that they could benefit from talking to someone, or that affect other areas of their life, but we wouldn't necessarily consider them traumatic.
And so, Bill, there are a number of responses that people can have to a traumatic event. Let's talk about the spectrum and range of responses that people have.
Well, there are different categories. There are our senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. There are the physical reactions and responses. There's a whole classification of behavioral responses in terms of how people behave. In the disaster world, we call that population the worried well. There are the cognitive reactions and responses in terms of concentration and the impact of our thinking. How some of that conversation gets placed into the trauma of a divorce or a death or of a loved one also has to do with the ingredients of vulnerability and lack of control over the event or the situation, an event with very little, if any, warning. So, the impact, the sudden impact of a death or a divorce or that's sort of where it kind of squeezes into the spectrum as well.
And you're nodding your head there. What would you like to add?
Absolutely. That the suddenness and sometimes the personal nature of things might move things into that trauma spectrum.
That trauma category. Census. You brought up census as one aspect of the response. Tell our audience a little bit more about that.
Well, depending on the research that you read, basically our senses are recording everything that has happened in our life from the time we were in our mom's womb. and those senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And we've all heard about the fight, flight, or freeze response. That's natural. It's the wonderful mechanism in our brain where we don't have to think about fleeing or freezing or staying or fighting back, which actually really are very basic instincts.
We just do those things automatically.
Absolutely. Yep. We don't really have to think about them initially. You know, we might rethink the plan, but so trauma or traumatic events get recorded most of the time by more than one sense. Example of that might be more common, the visual, the sight of a trauma. A lot of times the sound of the trauma, and many times the smell of a trauma. So the brain automatically will focus on the sense during the event that is most important to our survival or to our being able to problem solve it or try to make some sense out of it. And oftentimes it are those senses that come back or that replay. We term it flashback. But it's a lot of those senses, and in a lot of the work, you know, that the population that I specifically deal with, those senses, not only sight but sound and smell, are and auditory hearing are very prominent for people.
And I have had that experience of my own. The people that I work with who are very easily triggered by smells, and I talk with them about that the part of your brain that processes smell sits right up against your memory center, and that is how smell is so powerfully encoded and then can be triggered when the same smell is presented. So if your house burns down and you're fleeing your burning house, and the next time you smell a campfire, that it can trigger that memory.
Yeah.
When I explain it to people and explain it to kids, I kind of explain trauma as exactly the recording analogy, that when traumatic events happen, our brains record them on a lot of different tracks. So they record all of those senses, they record the emotions, and they record the story. And all of those things get recorded in different parts of our brain, and they can all be activated in terms of producing kind of a trauma response or flashbacks or nightmares or kind of disturbances that we might see later after the traumatic event.
Do kids experience trauma differently than adults?
They, depending on the age of the kid, they do, and I think there are a lot of similarities. There's some kids are able to just kind of identify traumatic events as being a bad event, and they kind of are able to limit it there. Other kids have, I would say, their thinking style is such that adults are supposed to help them and keep them safe, and so if the source of the trauma is an adult, then they can kind of lose trust in this idea of trust or safety. So I think because kids naturally have less control in their lives, that issue of control becomes different in kids than it is for adults commonly.
I love, though, what you just said about how some kids just chalk it off as a bad event because they don't have that broad categorization, and sometimes they don't have the ability to categorize the way adults have. It's either a good event or a bad event, and so it goes into the bad event pile, just like when Santa didn't bring me what I wanted. Exactly. And that actually then presents a resilience factor in some of these children.
Absolutely. Some of the, Bill mentioned the thoughts that get associated with the trauma and how that can sometimes be how people respond to problems after traumatic events. And so for kids, if they don't make a meaning out of it that kind of destroys a belief they had about their life, it is very much, bad event.
So you had mentioned that there are some factors that maybe predict a more difficult recovery from a traumatic event. One of them being how much perceived control perhaps that you had over the situation, but name some others for us.
Well, the idea of having experienced any sort of past traumas. For me, one of the key one is what we call interpersonal human aggression or violence, because we do that becomes personal. When we survive a tornado, and that can be traumatic, and sort of natural disasters versus man-made disasters. Man-made disasters are much more personal. There's usually revenge that takes place. So events that are traumatic, that are more violent or vengeful or caused by humans for purposeful reasons are classified usually as the probability of going to be more difficult. Not necessarily to get through, but that we'll probably see a higher rate of early on symptoms with that. So past traumas, we always think of the term exposure. What have you been exposed to? So whether you were literally right then and there, or sometimes it can be as, if not more traumatic, if you are witnessing or are farther off. Control and vulnerability are some of the other things in terms of, how much more warning did we actually have, experiences in dealing with other difficulty events, those types of things. So.
And I would add kind of the nature of the relationship, the closer a person is.
Absolutely,
in terms of the interpersonal trauma, the more difficult, and the sense of randomness, that even in interpersonal traumas, if there's a randomness, that tends to be a little easier on a general scheme than if things are personal or if people are targeted.
And then how prolonged the trauma is, too, right?
Absolutely.
So if you're in combat for a year, or if you're redeployed, or if you're in a concentration camp, that's different than being held hostage for one day. And we're not saying that being held hostage for one day is not traumatic. We're saying that the scope of what you're having to deal with is on a different scale.
Well, and again, how the whole idea of trauma evolves, and it comes about in the first place is again those natural instincts of fight, flight, or freeze are automatically triggered. So, for example, when you're in combat or when you're in war or when you're in a prolonged event, and if the event again is more possibly harming or aggressive or violent, those senses are like turned on. They're like keeping your heater on or your air conditioning on for 20 hours instead of just 2 hours. So that's why duration and length of time, because one of the things that happens with our warriors happens because those senses are triggered and almost overused for a period of time, and when they come back, whether you're law enforcement, or whether you're a county attorney up in Cook County fighting the war on crime and abuse, or whether you're actually in battle, the longer that you are continually exposed, to some degree you can get sensitized to that and get comfortable, but from a sensory standpoint, it's like they're overworked and overloaded.
And our producer had asked me the question before the show, well, if you experience one traumatic event and you recover from that, does that actually help you if there's another traumatic event? And this is suggesting that repeated exposure to trauma is not so helpful. And so, Sabrina, helpful, not helpful, depends on the person.
I would say it depends on the person. It depends on the nature of the trauma. If they're two traumas that are of a different type, that might be a little different than two traumas of the same type. Unfortunately, what research tells us is that people who are traumatized in one way are prone to traumas in that same, repeated traumas in that same way. Or, if it's law enforcement, that it's their career to be exposed to some of those things. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, it depends on the natural resiliencies they bring to it. And I think it also depends on the meaning they made in their recovery from the first event. So if they kind of said, well, this happened to me and it's not good, but I had a lot of support and I'd rather it happen to me than someone who doesn't have any family to help them. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a strength-based meaning that they make versus someone who said to themselves, this is, the world is kind of scary and no matter what you do, the world's going to be a bad place.
Or I deserve bad things to happen to me.
Right, I deserve bad things. That those people kind of set themselves up. So even though they may recover, the next time something happens, it's proving their theory correct.
And so one of the things that I talk a lot about, a concept I talk a lot about on the show on various different episodes, is that notion that life is 10% experience and 90% what you do with that experience. And it sounds like, Bill, that's no different when it comes to coping with trauma.
Absolutely. Your ability, There are many things about trauma that we have absolutely little, if any, control over, which again exposes us to that vulnerability and that helpless feeling. The thing we can control, and the thing that is vastly important for anybody who, has, whether it's a car wreck or whatever, a bad storm or lightning on the golf course, is that it's going to be your perception and your ability to how you think and reframe this event. Essentially, the way you think of it, that is going to be above anything else, most fundamental and helpful in your being able to get through it. Most people will get through trauma on their own. About 75 to 80% of it, there'll be a 2-week thing, a month thing, a couple of month thing, this or that. You'll get some little flashes over a period of time. Most people will have the resiliency on their own. They'll get through it just fine.
Which is amazing, I think. I think it's amazing when this is the level of trauma, distress that we're talking, that 75 to 80% of us will have some distress within the first 2 months, but then we'll make this complete recovery.
Yeah.
So there's hope, obviously, right? People can recover and do recover. Let's talk a little bit about what are the treatment approaches. And in fact, here's a question, so I'll read it now. This is a trauma survivor, Susan from Superior, called in and said, explain cognitive behavioral therapy and how it will help. Ms. Sabrina.
Well, I think that's exactly what Bill was talking about in terms of that overcoming the trauma depends on how we frame it and how we perceive it. So the idea behind cognitive behavioral therapy is that our thoughts affect our feelings, and if we feel that I deserve bad things to happen to us, if we think that, the associated feeling is sadness or hopelessness or depression, and then we might behave in a way where we withdraw. So if we change that thought into, bad things happen to everyone, for example, it might still be kind of a sad thought, but it's less hopeless, and then it would allow people's behavior to do something different or more positive. So that's kind of the basics of cognitive behavioral therapy. So we look at that meaning making.
The Wizard of Oz is a great example of cognitive behavioral therapy. If people view the world, if people view the wizard like the wizard is on the screen versus it's just a man behind the curtain, a lot of times when people are anxious, when people have that hypervigilance to the trauma, to those senses start to get acute and high, a lot of times they're viewing the world like it's a big scary place and that's the wizard, versus the reality that there's an event and it's just the man behind the curtain. So that cognitive, their ability to almost parent themselves, to calm themselves, to go, no, whoop, okay, my alarms are starting to go here, and let me assess and let me take a look at this situation realistically. And if anybody hasn't seen The Wizard of Oz, please watch it because it's great.
The avoidance is a big aspect of post-traumatic stress disorder, which I think people have heard a lot about. Tell us about what the treatment approaches are, what the treatment approaches that you use in terms of helping people overcome that avoidance practice that they use, which we know increases anxiety in a person's life.
Right. I think avoidance is one of those fight, flight, which is avoid, or freeze responses. And so we tend to avoid things that make us uncomfortable. And so if thoughts or memories of something make us uncomfortable, there are some people who work really hard to avoid that. The problem is that avoidance takes more energy than thinking about it. So it's that notion of don't think about a pink elephant. And sure enough, you have to think about a pink elephant to know that you're not thinking about a pink elephant.
You all have now a pink elephant in your head, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so part of overcoming that avoidance involves having people talk about, think about the memories that are distressing to them in an environment that's safe. And in some ways, if we go back to that recording idea, we want to separate the tracks. So we want the story of what happened to not elicit all of the emotions that people are having to avoid. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, to do that, a lot of times we do have to trigger or cause them to think about those scary memories or feelings or thoughts or senses that cause them distress.
In order for the memories to move from their traumatic raw nerve state into a this is a bad memory that I have. I will never call it a good memory, but it doesn't create that emotional turmoil within myself.
Well, and there certainly are times, it's like the old days, listen to the doctors on call reminds me of the story about, the old story about you went to the doctor and you say, Doc, every time I do this, it hurts. And the doc says, well, don't do it. So avoidance can have a place in the spectrum of moving through, moving beyond, getting, being resilient and overcoming and being successful with the nature of the event. And certainly, we had talked about, exposure therapy, desensitization. There's many different models of practices, preferred practices out there, in terms of being able to get little bits and pieces at a time to restore it, and then to process and think through that. So.
Here's a great question from a viewer. After a traumatic event, should a person be treated even if they don't have any symptoms? And this brings to mind some of certainly the critical incident work that you do an awful lot of, Bill, and that both of you were involved in for the recent shooting up in the Grand Marais courthouse. Talk a little bit, Bill, maybe I'll have you go first on this, about that whole immediately after a trauma, what do we say to people to do?
Well, first of all, the general best practice and belief is that the people that are exposed to trauma will have, again, common normal reactions and responses to the event. Again, that's just how our systems are wired, okay, back to the senses and the physical things that we had talked about earlier. So, the incidences, or the incident up in Grand Marais, you had a majority of people that work together daily. You had interpersonal relationships. You had interpersonal human aggression in terms of violence, and that these people, were exposed to this at various, throughout the day or throughout that period of time. And so the belief going in is that there's going to be the major portion of that population that was in that environment, as well as some of their family, because you've got family at home and what's happening to mom or dad or sister, brother at the courthouse, because the whole world knows that the courthouse had this incident. So again, you pretty well go into the idea just assuming that people are going to have common and normal reactions and responses, not necessarily are going to be traumatized, but again, these senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, physically, emotional, are going to alarm.
And so what you're doing is you're educating people about these really are normal, these are the normal reactions that you can expect. And then the related question, I think, would be, how do you know when it's time to get help, Sabrina?
I think one of the key ways that you know is if it's taking up a lot of mental energy or it's interfering with other aspects of your life. So if you've been in a horrible car accident and now, you'll go to the grocery store on this one particular road, but you're really scared to go visit, your friend across town, that's an example of where it's starting to interfere with your life. Or if it's, intrusive thoughts are coming in, you're going about your work, but these thoughts are coming in and they're causing you to pause and they're taking away energy, and that happens for a little while. Those would be times when we'd say, it's a good idea to go talk to someone to see if maybe you do need some help. My philosophy is that assessment can never hurt.
Absolutely. We would rather people be cautious about that. And I always love telling somebody that they have an acute case of nothing at all.
Yeah. Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about resilience, because we're getting close to time here, Bill. Resilience, does everybody have it? Can you learn it?
Everybody has it. There certainly are pieces and components of resilience that you can put in your toolbox that you can learn. I think that is something, it's a popular term these days, but it's really a cornerstone and foundation to recovery and moving through is to assume and expect that people have what it takes to move it through this experience. And sometimes they need a little help and support, but we all have that concept of resiliency. And for people to really understand what it is about their heritage, their family, their beliefs, their spirituality, there's a variety of cornerstones to the resiliency factor.
And we see resilience in children as well?
Absolutely. In being connected to families and social skills and, having a variety of activities that they enjoy, being connected to adults outside their immediate family, that those can be things that are about resiliency in kids.
And I love that concept that we don't have to be born with all of the resilience that we will need through the rest of our life, that we can get help in terms of shoring that up. And we are out of time. So I think the take-home message here is, once again, it's 10% experience, 90% what you do with experience. And even if you've experienced a traumatic event or multiple traumatic events, help is available, and help works, and help helps, and there's a reason to be hopeful out there. Thanks again to all of you for being here. And don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links, and read my blog, the place where I answer more of your questions. Please tune in for next week's show, when we talk about suicide, what we can do as individuals and what we can do as a community to help reduce the risk of suicide. That's next time on Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.